It's been just over 2 years, she said in an abrupt transition, since the MeToo hashtag began trending around the world. A message of solidarity for victims of sexual violence. Those two little words triggered a global reckoning for the film and television industry. Hollywood celebrities called perpetrators to account publicly, and dozens of accused men, like producer Harvey Weinstein, lost their jobs. But the movement was born much earlier than 2017 and a long way from Hollywood.
I started this work 2006, 2007 while working with young Black and brown girls in the South, trying to find resources for them because they were survivors of sexual violence. And as a survivor myself, I knew that it was important for me to try to figure out what safe space looked like for them.
It was the tweet heard round the world. The actor, Alyssa Milano. She sent out this tweet.
Alyssa Milano was the one who set it off.
I thought if women could just come forward and say Me Too, then we could really start to shape this and get an idea of the magnitude of this issue. There were 53,000 replies.
This is Tarana Burke.
Joining us now to talk about all of this, Tarana Burke.
Tarana Burke joins me now from Los Angeles.
I could never have envisioned something that would change the world. I was trying to change my community.
There's a ton of celebrities who have joined in.
Every woman deserves justice.
Me too.
Women are speaking their truths. They're speaking up.
I think it's a pandemic. It's through every industry.
Each one of those celebrities is like a microcosm for probably 1,000 women who don't have celebrity status.
What do we want?
There's now this evidence and data that is undeniable that this is epidemic across the world, sexual violence. And at the same time, there is this community of people who understand each other and who know that they have support in some way.
The backlash has been hard.
People are now worried that men will just say, you know what, these women are bringing lawsuits, let's not hire them. You think that's going to happen?
It then affects the ability for the normal chat-up process because guys are actually terrified. They think, my God, if I put a foot wrong here, I'm in trouble.
You will have women reporting and complaining and attacking men or calling them out on relatively minor things, you know, misunderstandings, if you like.
In this case, you're guilty until proven innocent. I think that is a very, very dangerous standard for our country.
Somebody asked me in an interview yesterday, what about the people who don't agree with Me Too? And I was like, what is there not to agree with? Right? We're not asking for weird things. It's like, if you want to touch me, can you please ask permission?
Yes means yes and no means no.
This is a moment that we can build from, but we don't stop here.
I think that I'll be doing this work for the rest of my life, and I hope in my lifetime that I see substantial change, but if I don't, I'll probably die with a Me Too shirt on.
Well, Tarana Burke is in Sydney to accept the City of Sydney Peace Prize, and she joins us on the program tonight. Thank you so much for coming in. It's lovely to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Take us right back to the beginning. What was the story or the occasion or the event that inspired the hashtag MeToo?
Well, I didn't start the hashtag, and so my work started in community. I was an organizer and a youth worker in Selma, Alabama in the early 2000s. And, you know, I'm a survivor of sexual violence myself and really wanted to do some work towards that, but didn't have a lot of support in the community for it. And it was really the young people that I was working with and their stories of sexual violence that finally compelled me to start to do something in our community to answer the violence that I was seeing. And once that started, it really just spread very quickly, similar to what we saw in 2017, because it's such a pervasive issue. So many people needed it. And we put it on the internet, we put it on MySpace to sort of have a place to live on the internet because that's the age that we were in. And once we did that, it exploded and we had adults coming and saying, you know, how can we join this? And thank you for starting it. And we've never looked back since.
And what were you saying that caught people's imagination, that made them hopeful and feel like they wanted to be activists and involved?
I think it was the power of empathy. You know, Me Too is the catchphrase, but what we talk about is this is empowerment through empathy for survivors of sexual violence. Sexual violence, when you experience it, is incredibly isolating. Most people who have that experience think that they have the worst of it, or think that maybe it's not the worst of it, so they shouldn't say anything, but they deal with it in very isolated ways. And so having somebody to say Me Too to says that you're not alone, and it immediately gives you community, and that's what we saw happen on the internet and when it went viral. People found community with one another, and just simply knowing that you alone didn't go through this experience, there's some comfort in that. And it evokes empathy between people is what we need, because people need to understand what surviving sexual violence is like.
Nicole, you're a disability activist, but you've spoken on this program about the decade of really horrific sexual abuse that you suffered at the hands of a former partner. Just truly horrific. Was there that sense that resonate with you, that sense of being alone and isolated?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is incredibly isolating, especially when you're talking about rape in marriage, where it's a taboo. It's not something that people are comfortable talking about, hearing or sitting with, and it's incredibly isolating. And I remember having to go to court by myself, to hear sentencing hearings and just being supported by a court staff. There hasn't been a community of people around me around that aspect of what happened to me. I get to talk about family violence and domestic violence on quite a broad spectrum, on programs like this, but when it comes down to the actual sexual assault and the issue of rape, people are so uncomfortable talking about it. Absolutely, and I still feel isolated with it, because I go into some circles and I talk about that as a disabled woman, and people are so uncomfortable because I've got a disability, and then I can go into other
the issues of sexuality and disability together.
The issues of sexuality. Wow. Yeah, absolutely, and then I can go into some disability circles, and they just don't want me to talk about it in some disability circles as well. So I kind of feel siloed and separated and ignored in both areas, and people are just not ready to confront it. And I'm there waiting when they are, but I don't know how to change people's ideas, and I just keep putting bits and pieces out there, short of being deliberately provocative and possibly traumatising people. I don't know how else as an individual that I can do that, and I don't feel that the MeToo movement has helped women in my position at all.
If I could just add to what Nicole's saying, that I think the particular problem that people with disabilities have is often the difficulty of communication. Tarana's talking about communicating, being able to share an experience, and yet a lot of people with disabilities can't do that. No. They mightn't be able to do it because of physical restraints. They can't get out of the house. And secondly, they may have intellectual disabilities which make communication very difficult.
I wonder what you think of the movement now, Tarana, because I think, when I was reading about the work that you still do, you're talking about disrupting school to prison and sexual assault to prison pipelines through, action research and coalition building. You're talking about young women of colour. And yet it's become this catch cry in corporate Australia about things that happen in the workplace that might impede women's progress.
So sexual violence happens on the spectrum, and all of that is included in this movement. And so sexual violence in the workplace is also an important aspect of it. My work started in the grassroots and with marginalized communities, and that's where my focus remains, but not to the exclusion of any other person or issue under that spectrum. So I think it's important that we acknowledge all of the ways that sexual violence affects all people. It's the one thing that doesn't discriminate. And because of that, there's no demographic that's not affected by it.
So you don't look at that and go, oh my goodness, some people will say, oh, the movement's been co-opted by women of privilege who are having difficulties at work. And sometimes are traumatised in that. But it's as you say, it's a different part of the spectrum to a young woman who's a lower socioeconomic woman who's been traumatised by rape and sexual violence.
The problem is when you solely focus on one area. So it hasn't been co-opted, I think it's been expanded. And I think, though, if we just focus on, what happens is that the mainstream media likes to focus on shiny things. And so if you have privileged white women who are rich saying, I'm having trouble in my job, and for them, they are speaking up for the first time a lot, and oftentimes, right? They haven't had the space to talk about the issues they've had at work. But what can also happen is that they can take up all the space in the room. And so when you have the sole focus on that, that becomes problematic. But I don't think it's problematic for women in the workplace to talk about their sexual harassment. If we don't deal with harassment, if we don't deal with harassing language and environments that make women uncomfortable, then we are allowing a culture to exist that allows for violence to happen. So all of it is important. None of it should be swept under the rug. Nobody should have more voice than the other, but you can't let it be a singular voice to represent a whole movement.
Can I turn to you, Amy? My colleague Virginia Trioli wrote a piece in the Weekend Press, and she talked about the sort of blunt instrument of zero tolerance, that somebody who is a jerk at work will be potentially treated under a zero tolerance policy the same way as somebody who is a predator, you know, who is a kind of a sociopath in the workplace. Is there a problem with that, and what's the impact of that?
I think it's so difficult to answer because exactly where this discussion has gone, what Tarana is saying about, you know, harassment mattering as well and expanding the movement, because you have so many, particularly men now, who will talk to you about Me Too, and they'll say something like, you know, oh, I wanted to compliment you on blah blah, but I can't because of the Me Too movement, or is this a Me Too thing, or can I say something nice to you, or are you going to Me Too me? And that, I think, has kind of co-opted a little bit of it in terms of like, do we need to protect men in this space? Because a lot of them seem to think that, yeah, they should be centered in this conversation, which is my issue with some of the reactions to it. The idea that we need somebody to be at the upper end of the spectrum to address crappy behavior or harassing behavior or things that make people, particularly women of color, just disabled women, anyone who is vulnerable, feel more vulnerable in a workplace is kind of ridiculous to me. I think we need to actually have pretty adult conversation about what this is, what exactly it is that people are asking for, and how we can all live together in that.
Troy, do you reckon some blokes feel vulnerable? They think there might be a witch hunt. They think they might be vulnerable to accusation?
I'm not sure about the witch hunts component of it, but I can only talk from my own experience and a conversation I had with a colleague just recently, a former colleague just recently. My office, when I was a minister, was staffed half and half with male and female. And as a regional minister, I had to go out on the road, stay overnight a lot of occasions, and you were very careful to make sure that even the perception didn't fall over to the reality if you had to travel with a female staff member. And we would make conscious decisions not to take a female if it was just me and a female, and/or we would, if we had to travel that way because of staffing resources, you know, put them in a different motel and you'd stay on the other side of town just so there would be no allegations that way. It's something you become conscious of. So I don't blame the movement for that. I just think that there's that potential in the community now to, you know, judge first and get to the reality later. But so far as being able to make sure that anyone that is subject to harassment or sexual violence, I was a cop for 22 years, did a lot of investigations for victims of sexual violence, and you know, I've seen the level of trauma that these victims go through, and they need all the support in the world that we can throw their way and support them. So it's hard to make sure you come up with the right solutions for those victims, which is absolutely necessary, without scarring or sort of, you know, putting a diagonal landscape on the work environment and stop you actually functioning as well, because you've got this fear factor of the perception.
Well, the fear factor, the fact that Me Too has become a verb in some people's minds. Oh, you've been Me Too'd.
Yeah, but that is because people don't want to deal with the actual issue. People who turn Me Too into a verb are incredibly disrespectful to the survivors who've actually said Me Too. This is people who want to be both victim and victimizer. You can't have it both ways. And so being Me Too'd is not a thing, right? Saying Me Too is a statement, a declarative statement made by survivors, period. You can't be Me Too'd. Because in workplaces now, men have to be more thoughtful. My question to men all the time is, what's the alternative? If you think Me Too has gone too far, what's the alternative? Should women be silent? Should we go back to a time where you had to deal with somebody touching you uncomfortable, you know, making you uncomfortable and unwanted touches? Should women who have, or people who have experienced sexual violence just not say anything? What's the alternative? What has to happen here is what she said, is that we do have to have reasonable conversations. We need people to come to the table. We need men to be less defensive and listen to. Men don't take the time to hear about what happens in the material lives of women. They don't think about how much we think about our safety in just a 24-hour period. Every single day, women across the world get up and they get dressed thinking about how safe they're going to be that day. They just want to make it from their home to work or school or wherever and back home safely.
And so what if you've got a conversation in a ministerial office or any office, Tarana, where someone's saying, well, should we stay on opposite sides of the city? Should we be in separate hotel rooms? Should we be in separate postcodes? What would you say?
I would say have that conversation with the women. What did you do before then, right? Was there rampant accusations of sexual misconduct in your office? If there was, then you should have a conversation about how you changed
He's
that.
saying no.
If there weren't that, then and there weren't any issues, then I don't see why you have to go into extremes because the MeToo movement is here all of a sudden, right? What it means is that we have normal conversations. But also what he just said is something that everybody should be. You should be more thoughtful. There's nothing wrong with being more thoughtful about how to operate.
Something?
Yes, indeed.
Tarana, could I ask you something? And
Sure.
I've read a lot about you, and I respect everything I've read. But just think of the quandary I was in tonight. I'd never met Nicole before, but I'd read about her, and I admired everything I read there. And when we met, I wanted to say to her, I love the colour of your hair. And then I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't say that.
Why did you think that?
Because I thought maybe she would be offended by my saying that.
And so what do you think the alternative would have been to her?
For her or for me?
For you.
Oh, I would have said nothing, and I did say nothing.
So now you have the person here that you wanted to say that to. If you said, you know, I don't mean any offense, I hope you don't take any offense, but I do love the color of your hair.
I've had multiple people comment on the colour of my hair. I dyed it for a reason because I enjoy it. I love it. I think it's great.
But do you see how that's an extreme
So you
example?
say that's a conversation.
It's a conversation. That's not a sexual connotation. It's different to other conversations where, as a disabled woman, where somebody would say to me, oh, you're not too bad looking. I do you.
Yeah. That's obviously inappropriate.
And that is inappropriate.
Right.
Commenting on somebody's hair when they've gone to a lot of trouble to look good, to feel good about themselves and feel good in their body, and to have another person go, geez, your hair looks fantastic.
And what was the preamble? What was the preamble that you put on that, Tarana? What was the preamble that he should say so that he doesn't come off as a creep?
Oh, just ask the question. Say, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, or I don't mean any offense by this, but I just wanted to compliment your hair. I think that we need to use common sense is the bottom line. I think that men are being extreme because they're uncomfortable. So it's better to go to the extreme and say, well, I can't do anything. These women are just, it plays into this idea that women are histrionics. We're prone to histrionics and exaggeration, and that's just not true. What you have is a moment in history where women are finally able to talk about things that have always made us uncomfortable.
Troy?
Yeah, Terry, I understand what you're saying there, but I can assure you that the females in my office didn't raise an issue. They didn't feel uncomfortable. When I raised, these protocols about, protecting them and me and the office generally, they're saying, don't be silly, there's no need for that. That was their attitude, but it wasn't about them, it's about the outside perception and what you may also get in certain industries as well, and political industries are certainly open for perception. We've had some incidents here in this country where that subject matters, hit the front pages. So you just got to be extra careful. And I just think that the MeToo movement has just made people way more conscious than they may have to be.
Just a quick check.
I think you're right.
It's interesting, isn't it? We've only got about 30 seconds left. Amy Remekas, you've got to be really careful, unlike the United States, when you publish anything about anybody in this country, because the defamation laws are pretty tough, right? So what is the risk that you're going to put on the front page that, minister sleeping in the same postcode as a staffer?
Well, exactly, and and the woman's career is suffering because of that, because she can't go and do trips that her male colleagues do. If there is no accusation, if there is no problem, then why take it to that extreme? Just like Tarana said, why do it? Just use common sense.
Okay, we got 20 seconds left, but I know you can do it for me because you're American. Have things changed? Have things changed? People say this pendulum swung too far and we're having these great conversations. Have things changed?
Things are changing, but they haven't completely changed. You can look at the numbers across the world. The numbers have not changed drastically, but I do think things are changing, and we need to keep pressing forward so that we can see substantial change in our lifetime.
It's been great to meet you. Thanks so much for coming on the program. That's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Anthony Wheely, Nicole Lee, Troy Grant and Amy Remekas. Thanks to Tarana Burke. Have a great evening. Kath Robinson's in tomorrow. Good night to you.